This is part 4 of creating a user and authenticating using Firebase. So I'm going to go into the documentation, and in that documentation where we first set up the Firebase file, towards the bottom we have some different products that we can use here. We're going to use the authentication, which is that firebase.auth that we added earlier. And we're going to start with the Google first, and there's other ways to do so, but we're going to start with the Google first. And this section is just going to provide us with some lines of code that we would add. Some are optional, but also just it's going to tell us how to call onto signing in with Google. And there's different ways that we can do that, like with a pop-up or with a redirection. And just kind of reading the documentation gives us more information on what to do. And then, there's even more instructions just depending on how deep you need to go with just authenticating. So in the documentation, it's telling me that I want to create a new instance of a provider, which is just going to handle us signing in. And I'm just going to copy the line of code just to avoid any typos with signing this instance to a variable. So inside of my Firebase, I am going to go ahead and make a comment and say Google auth. Just gonna paste that there, and then I'm gonna update the var to const. So then what we can take a look at in the documentation is just optional things that we can add onto the sign-in flow. One of the things to add is the custom parameters, and going into this documentation here, what that means is it tells us more what the login hint means or other options that we have. So here, this is talking about the login hint that we saw there and what that means, and then it gives us details. So it brings us to another documentation. And we can see what those options are that we can do with our authentication flow. So what login hint does, passes a hint, and then what prompt does, and then what fields that you would put into there. So we're going to do prompt, and then we're going to do select account. And then you can play with different ones too to see how that responds in your app. Back in my text editor, I'm going to go ahead and add the parameters, and that was an object. So this does tell me still the options that I have. So I'm going to say prompt, and the one that I was select account. What I want to do next is I want to go into my registration file, and where I created my Google sign-in button, I want to assign this button to a function that when clicked, it is going to do our Google authentication. So I haven't created this function yet, but I'm going to go ahead and assign it to it. So I'm going to say on click, This is going to be a sign in with Google function. And I'm going to keep this function in this same register file. And I'm going to place it underneath the onSubmit function. It's also going to be an arrow function. Sign in with Google. So what we're first going to set up is the authentication with Google in here. And then what this will also hold is another function that will also save this authenticated user into the database because they are two separate processes. So one handles the authentication, the other handles saving users into Firestore. Google provides us with an example of setting up our Google authentication where we have options. We can do sign in with pop-up, or we can do a sign in with redirect. And that's just the flow of how you sign in. And the sign in methods are going to be promises, so they're going to either return the authenticated user or give us an error. Now, the sign up methods can be set up as asynchronous functions as well, so you can just use, try, catch for just more of a cleaner look with the code. So we can just take this entire snippet of code here and just modify it to how we want it to look. So I'm going to paste this code snippet into my sign in with Google. And I do need to modify the code a little bit because I called firebase.auth. I just called it auth in our Firebase file. And instead of sign up with pop-up, I'm going to change this to redirect. You can keep pop-up if you prefer, but redirect is more mobile friendly. And the next thing I need to do is bring in the auth and the provider from the Firebase file. So at the top, I will import that. And then I get an error about the provider not being included from Firebase. So I'll need to make sure that that's exported. One thing that I do want to make sure I do is make sure that that on-click button is assigned correctly. So I need to add this .sign in with Google since that function is attached up here in our app. So now I'm going to go to Firebase and verify that we export this out. So I'm going to export the provider so that it's seen. And then React app measure is not defined. I'm going to just comment this out because I actually have seen this section not really being used in other documentation I read. So if we save everything, go back to our app, all right. So I open the network tab. Let's test out the button and see what happens. So I'll do sign in with Google. And on the side, we can see that we did connect successfully with our 200 error codes. Now, we didn't actually see anything that told us that we signed in, so that could be confusing as a user. But we also didn't see any type of prompt on our provider because we're supposed to be prompted which email address we want to use. If you don't get a prompt, that will be because you have not signed in to whichever browser you're using. You haven't used more than one email address. So if it's only aware of one email address, it's going to automatically assume that's the one you want. If I bring up a Google browser and then I do sign in with Google, I will get prompted to choose an email address because I have used more than one email address inside of Google. I've only used one email address inside of Firefox. Right now, I have Firebase pulled up. Since we didn't actually see anything on the front end telling us that we were signed in, let's check the back end to see if we actually authenticated. So in the dashboard, if you go to your authentication, here it will tell you what users have signed in from whichever providers. So if it's just email address, if it's Google, Twitter, etc. So I'm going to just delete this and do it one more time. And if I check Firebase and refresh, I'm authenticated. So I'm authenticated, but when I go into my database, I'm not there. So I have to set up the process to also save my sign-in into my database, which is Firestore. We'll get our sign out with Google button working and then move on to saving user in the database. So in the documentation for the Google sign-in, at the bottom, they do tell us how to sign out. And we just need to call on this method on our authenticated user. We just call on it to sign out. So I'm just going to copy this sample and go into my registration. And I'm going to create a function that I'll attach to the sign out button. So I'll call this sign out from Google, which will also be an arrow function. And then I'm going to paste that code inside. So again, I need to modify it by calling it just auth.signout. So if it's successful, I'm going to console.log you have signed out. Otherwise, I'm going to console.log the error.message. So I need to attach my sign out from Google method to my button or my function. So I'm do on click equals this dot sign out from Google. Now we can go and test this to see. I'm going to sign in again. And now I'm going to sign out and it should print that we are signed out. All right, so that works. So then we are going to move forward in our next video and actually save our authenticated user into Firestore.